Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Cristello. I'm the Director of Programming for EXPO Chicago. I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of The Scene. We hope that you'll pick up a copy of issue 3 at the stage, as well as multiple locations throughout the fair. On behalf of everyone at EXPO Chicago, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. It's the 5th edition of the fair this year, and we're really pleased with our lineup for Dialogues, which is presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute. It's a year-long series of panel discussions, conversations, provocative artistic discourse with leading artists and curators and thinkers on the current issues that engage them. Today we are thrilled to be presenting the very first panel, The New Global Economy, Contemporary Art from Africa and the Diaspora in the Marketplace. The panel was born out of a very modest invitation to Bomi Odufunade, the brilliant art advisor behind Dash and Rallo, which is the first and only international art advisory specializing in contemporary African art. She is joined today by collector, Toronto-based Kenneth Montague, who's the collector and founder of Wedge Curatorial Projects, our very own Yesomi Umolu, curator of the Logan Center Exhibitions Program at the University of Chicago, and artist Mary Sibande, who's represented by Gallery Momo in Cape Town and Johannesburg, who we're thrilled to have showing at the fair for the very first time this year. I hope that you'll join me in welcoming our panelists. Enjoy the talk. Hello.
Hello? You can hear me? Morning, everybody. You can all hear me. Slightly nervous. Firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss how artists are working on the continent, in Africa especially, and how it's interwoven with a collector, a curator, and an artist. This was born out of Africa becoming the fastest growing continent in the world, and how it's adapted with technology and its impact, especially social impact, political impact, and how specifically it's challenging for artists, but also collectors acquiring work and curators curating work in the 21st century. We're going to start a conversation with Kenneth, and then we'll move on to Yesomi and then Mary, and then we're going to interweave how they all work individually and all work together. Sorry, can you hear me properly? Yeah. Firstly, Kenneth, you started your collection, or let's say you started collecting in the 90s, primarily photography. Kenneth's collection is basically, its identity is Black artists all across the world. Can you just tell us a bit of how it began?
Sure, Bomi, thanks. Could you pass the clicker over? It might help.
Oh, okay.
I'll kind of run through this
Okay.
quickly, and making you do all that. Thanks, Bomi. So I'm a Canadian. My parents are both from Jamaica and emigrated in the 60s, late 50s actually, but in the 60s I was born in Canada, and we're a very small indigenous Black population in Canada, probably less than 1%, but in the major cities like Toronto, maybe 1 out of 10 folks are Black, so there's some hope. But Canada is a real island in a lot of ways, and really a story about my own identity is reflected in my collection, as it turns out. It's like I was searching for self and was interested in reflections of Black identity and Black culture throughout the world. So I work as a dentist in Toronto, and I started collecting what I could afford to. And the last 20 years, I've grown a collection that's, I would say, representative of not only traditional and modern, but mostly contemporary African artists. And so zipping through this now, I'll just show you how the collection evolved and how it reflects my evolving tastes. So,
Also,
go ahead.
what you should
Just
do is
you-
also
yeah.
talk a little bit about how, the initial collection, began.
Right.
And what led to you starting a specific collection on Black identity.
Okay. Well, I had a home, a loft in Toronto that doubled as a commercial gallery, actually, and started pulling in works that spoke to me about my own identity, really, that was kind of pulling in a Jamaican, American, and an African kind of view. And I started with artists like James Vanderzee, Harlem Renaissance photographer from New York, and artists like Seydou Keita, Malik Sidibe, Ojikere, West African artists that were kind of first discovered, I think, by Western eyes, and they kind of were the artists that entered the market first. And I think that there's a kind of a beautiful story that's being told in a forgotten history that ended up being pulled to the surface. But very quickly, my tastes evolved, and the way that I used those works was and presented them in Toronto was in shows like this. This is a show called Headroom, where we had a public hair cutting, like a barber shop. That's my Jamaican barber there. But we pulled the works together. You can see a Chris O'Philly painting with Seydou Keita photograph. It was all kind of, the trope was hairstyles and thinking about Black identity through hairstyle, a very old idea, but kind of a new way of presenting these kind of works. And then things moved along. I started taking lots of trips to the continent. I joined the Tate Africa Acquisitions Committee. I was starting to give talks about collecting African art, ending up in places as diverse as Ethiopia to South Africa to Mali for the Bamako Biennale, and met lots of artists, started seeing Africa as a whole, started acquiring work from North Africa, artists like Mohamed Borisa, Hassan Hajjaj, and Ida Malune from Ethiopia. Presented those works in a show in Toronto that toured around Canada. And then started getting, well, I guess, a lot more contemporary in my taste, and starting to think about new stories and artists like Atipatra Ruga, who I saw in performance in South Africa, Zanelli Maholi, and her very personal take on identity. And then, of course, I started coming back to North America and acquiring works like Chicago-based Rashid Johnson, and his very personal take as well. And then put those works together in a very large show that toured around, started at MoCAD in Detroit, and then I think these shots are from the Nasher Museum at Duke University. That was a show that had over 100 works. And you can see I'm now moving into video and thinking about photography in a broader way. And then ultimately put together a show that reflects my own identity. I think it was Thelma Golden from the Studio Museum in Harlem that said to me, "You've been bringing all these works from around the world to Canada. It's time for you to start telling your own stories." And I agreed with her, and I was always collecting works from African Canadian artists. It was time to put that together. And as you can see, I primarily was a photography collector to this point, and put the show together, Position as Desired, which I'm very proud of, because it was like a story that hadn't been told around thinking about Black identity in Canada through contemporary photography. And that's the work of Dawit Petros, who's actually with us today. And Dawit's got a project here at EXPO Toronto, or EXPO Chicago. And I think he's very emblematic of the African Canadian experience. Born in Eritrea, moved to Western Canada, to the prairies, went to art school in Montreal, in French Canada, and then did graduate work in Boston. Now is living and teaching in Chicago. Just a very, the show was to sort of reflect this many different ways of being Black, rather than this sort of very singular narrative around being a Black Canadian, for instance. And then starting to move the collection in other directions beyond photography lately. This is the work of Tall Waste, who's a Canadian, Toronto-based artist who's now moved to New York. And this is very recent work. Jelani Morgan, Toronto-based artist, it's an image that he shot of a die-in that was held, one of the first rallies of the Toronto Black Lives Matter movement. I think when, yeah, this was 2014 December, so it was Eric Garner's death that was being considered that day. And work that I just acquired in the last 2 months from Anik Jordan, who's from Trinidad but lives in Toronto, and thinking about a forgotten history of black churches in Toronto. Moving forward, I'm about to wrap up here. There's some work from Ebony Patterson, thinking about my own Jamaican identity, and then starting to get into design. It works from Stephen Burks. This is how I live in Toronto. My wife, Sarah, who's a museum consultant, she's here. You can see we don't live like this now, that we have a 2-year-old, but the art still moves around. You can see a painting from Lynette Yadim Boakye, and an important painting from Barclay Hendricks in the bottom left. We have a nonprofit organization called Wedge Curatorial Projects that not only thinks about my collection, but brings new work forward from emerging artists. And last year at the Venice Biennale, I saw a great video in the Angolan pavilion from Benelli Hurcan. And I thought we could show that, maybe we can show that later, because it would kind of signify where the collection's at and maybe where contemporary African art is moving. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Kenneth. One of the things we wanted to discuss with this conversation was how new stories have been created, especially with Kenneth's collection. And one of the interesting things with Yomisi's work as a curator is how she interprets how artists are working together today in Africa, and how that translates into the curatorial sphere. And I wanted to know how you feel, how artists from, say, a decade ago are interpreting new stories, and how they're adapting to the environment.
Thank you. So I presented, thought I would talk about a project that I worked on quite recently in the Broad Art Museum in Michigan, which is a project called Material Effects, Contemporary Art from West Africa and the Diaspora. And I think actually there's a lot to be said in that title. For one, I fought quite strongly to try and just call the exhibition Material Effects, because I was quite conscious of the kind of weight and the histories around Africa and Africanness and forms of naming around the diaspora. But I didn't win that battle, but it's okay. So it was important for me then to kind of present an exhibition that was clear that this is an exhibition that was being curated by an African who is in the diaspora. I'm of Nigerian origin. I was born in Nigeria and moved to England when I was around 10, and actually didn't return to Nigeria for about 15 years. And only recently have I started to kind of go back to cultivate relationships with my family, but also with kind of artists in the country. And so to think about how African identity is varied, so how it's really important to understand that some artists are working on the continent and their work circulates within that network, while other artists have kind of very close connections to an international kind of diaspora, and their work circulates more globally and internationally. So the show became Material Effects, Contemporary Art from West Africa and the Diaspora. And I think something is to be said about Kenneth's collection in terms of thinking about that continuous dialogue between Africa as being located on the continent and then elsewhere. But the exhibition brought together 6 artists, 6 contemporary artists working across video, installation, performance, and sound to look at the idea of kind of objects and materiality in contemporary Africa. And the exhibition really started with my interest in going to the continent, as I said, it's been a kind of a recent return for me. My interest in going to the continent to do some research and locating my research specifically in Nigeria, which is where I'm from, in Ghana, which I was very, very interested in exploring more because they have a very kind of small but very active contemporary art scene. And then Senegal, because of the histories around kind of the strength of cultural production and cultural discourse of Senegal, starting from the 60s and 70s with Léopold Senghor and his really kind of promotion of forms of Africanness and creativity within that realm, within the country, and then of course the Dakar Biennial, which has become kind of the flagship biennial for the continent. So to locate my research in that area and to do kind of really intensive studio visits and kind of institutional kind of conversations as well. And as I spent what was probably around 2 weeks or more traveling between Lagos, Abuja, Dakar, and Accra, I was very unsure about what type of exhibition I would put together, because even thinking about the differences between Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa, and how do you tie practices that are related but actually very distinctly different, given the kind of cultural spheres within which they kind of exist. How do you tie all those things together? And actually it was a considerable amount of time that I spent in the studio of Issa Samb in the center of Dakar. So Issa Samb is a seminal Senegalese artist who was very active in the 1970s, who was part of a sort of pioneering group of kind of multidisciplinary practitioners that were thinking about forms of Africanness that were inherently hybrid. And whereas kind of under the kind of reign of Senghor, there was this idea of Pan-Africanism, a sort of essentialization of African identity, they were interested in African identity that kind of took in the different tribal distinctions that might exist on the continent, but also influences from the surrealists in Paris and other kind of creative practitioners internationally. And he has this fantastic studio, which is kind of a living sculpture where he has been kind of amassing objects over a number of years and decades, and objects that would kind of fall in and out of kind of sculptural assemblages that he makes either on his own or with other folks. And also this space, his courtyard, is also kind of a site for performances and political discussions and exchange. And it was my time spent there thinking very much kind of very openly about his conception of the object and its kind of fluidity within Senegalese culture, but also at the same time within kind of his artistic practice, that I began to weave a sort of conversation and narrative with other artists that I was encountering. So I spent some time in Accra. I encourage you to go to Accra. I think it's one of the most active kind of art scenes in West Africa right now, really kind of spearheaded by folks in Kumasi with the art school there, and really young, engaged artists coming out of Ghana as a whole. And was able to kind of work with Ibrahim Mahama, who had a large-scale installation at the Venice Biennial just previous to presenting this work here. And he works a lot with kind of material residues in the country, particularly the jute sack, which is kind of used as a sort of primary means of circulating goods around the country. And he engages in conversations with traders, market people, to kind of broker and barter to get these sacks into his possession, and then to present installations with them. So we were able to present what I think was one of his most ambitious installations at the Broad Art Museum in Michigan there. And then also thinking about, again, this question of the diaspora and what that means, whereas someone like Ibrahim is based in Ghana and very, very dedicated to kind of the context there. You have other artists like Otobong Nkanga, who is of Nigerian origin but has lived in Europe for a very long time. And she's also really interested in kind of the circulation of objects and their meaning, in particular thinking about her origins and her background. And so this is a piece where she looks at the kind of histories of the kola nut and how it's kind of traveled from the continent outside as well. And then new performance, I think something that's kind of, I say new performance, but performance is intrinsic, I think, to kind of cultural practices on the continent, from the histories of masquerade and forms of ritual. You have figures like Jaleli Atiku, who are kind of really working with that heritage and kind of repositioning it within the kind of urban context of Nigeria. And so he's an artist that does a lot of performance-based works that respond to kind of human rights issues and questions in Nigeria. And he's very much thinking about kind of the symbolism behind the different materials that we might engage in within the urban context. And we were able to kind of present an installation that kind of evolved through performance at the Broad MSU. And then finally, I'll just sweep through very quickly to the work of Bernard Akoi Jackson, who's also a fantastic performance artist from Ghana, thinking about the colonial histories and objects and kind of natural resources on the continent and their exploitation and circulation, and thinking about forms of stereotyping that we might kind of project onto African bodies. And he presented a fantastic, mesmerizing performance for us in the galleries as well. Very humorous. He has a very kind of witty personality, and that comes through very much so in his performances. And then finally, the work of Zora Opoku, who is, again, a diasporic being of German Nigerian heritage, who also recently just returned to, German Ghanaian heritage, who recently returned to Ghana to kind of rediscover her origins, and has been doing this through kind of research in textile cultures and histories on the continent. And she was able to present a series of sculptures and video works for us at the Broad. So that's just an example of kind of my interest, which I think similarly to Kenneth is about a sort of rediscovery of self,
Yeah.
and using that sort of quest to kind of explore artistic practices on the continent.
One of the most unique things about material effects is that most of the artists in the show are either born and based on the continent or either moving back to the continent. One of the things is that's very interesting with this generation of artists working on the continent is that they're choosing to stay rather than come to the West to have their work shown. Mary was born in South Africa, in Johannesburg, which she continues to live and work. South Africa has one of the strongest scenes in Africa, with an amazing gallery system, museum system. And what is extraordinary is there's a huge generation of artists now graduating from school and choosing to stay in either Joburg or Cape Town or Durban. I want you to tell us a bit about the ideas of why you chose to be an artist in South Africa, and interestingly, how you practice, because you're very unusual. A decade ago, most people were working in just photography and sculpture. We've now seen a shift away to more industrialized way of working, which I say performance, video, but you work on a grand scale and installation.
This work is titled "They Don't Make Them Like They Used To." So it's basically performance where I dress up as Sophie.
Tell us a bit about Sophie. So people know.
Well, when I was constructing this work or thinking about it or conceptualizing around the idea of what kind of art should I make, and I had a headline in my head, a construction of a new hero, the birth of Sophie. In 2009, I had a solo exhibition at Gallery Momo. So that exhibition was basically paying homage to the women in my family who were all maids, from my great-great-grandmother up to my mother. And then came me, who was born in the 80s. I was fortunate enough that apartheid was ending, and I was able to acquire a degree in fine art. Unlike my mother, who had wishes and aspirations of becoming a nurse, but she didn't get that chance to be whatever she wanted to be because of apartheid. So this show was curated in a way that was in a semi-secular formation. The first figure, this one here, when you walk into the gallery, represented my great-grandmother. And the second figure represented my grandmother. And the third figure represented my mother. But with the third figure, it's doing something unlike the other figures where the viewer is looking at the figures as they're about to do something, but this one is actually active. In 2008, I was in New York during Black History Month. I came across this image of Madam C.J. Walker, and I started Googling her, reading about her, and I found that the story is actually parallel to my mother's story, in that this woman, Madam C.J. Walker, became a millionaire in the 1920s in America, and she invented her cream relaxer to straighten hair. And then back home, my mother, how she moved out of servitude is that she got a job at a local hair salon, and of course the rest was history. And now she's a businesswoman, like, well, in a small scale, not like Madam C.J. Walker. Yeah. And then this work, which was the last figure within the show, represented me. And then now this work this figure is wearing a different color, unlike the other ones where they're wearing variations of blue, different tones of blue. This one here is wearing purple. And for me, while I was thinking, like, what kind of color? Because color is very important in my work, and color is very important in South Africa. When I say color, I'm talking about race. So I needed to emphasize that. And when I was thinking of a color that should represent me, I thought of purple. I've done research on colors, and I came across the color purple. And it's a very special color in that in the olden days in Europe, if someone is wearing purple robes, it means that they are clergy or they are rich. And my grandmother always says that I'm a special one, so I thought, well, what is a special color for me that represents me will be purple. And this work is called I Decline. So I looked at images of the 1900s postcards that were circulating during those times, where the black female body was depicted reclining or as specimens. And I thought, well, I want a dress that is actually, this is actually the first dress that I made that was big. So from the hem of the dress up to the waist, it's about 6 meters, so it's quite a huge dress. And this figure is running away from the chaise lounge, she's running away from being scrutinized. She's running away from reclining. And through about 5 years, so I've been looking at stories within the family, well, within the women in my family, and I thought, well, there's an absent masculinity that I need to represent, and I introduced my father. But the way I introduced him is that I didn't know him until I think I was 15. They broke up with my mother when I was about 3. So how I knew him was my mother had 4 photos. And 3 of those photos, my father is carrying a machine gun because he was in the South African army, actually still is to this day. And I thought how I envisioned him or how I knew of him was through my grandmother's stories and my mother. And hence he takes on a female form. And the toy formation of it is that it talks about my childhood or how I imagine him. And this work is titled Lovers in Tango. So it talks about the relationship that my mother and my father had. Well, actually, it never happened. So how I see him is that he comes as an army, so he comes as many people. And then these 2 figures, we can see them, the female figure and the male figure, if you were to put them together, it'll do a tango. But of course, a space in between them, so the tango will never happen. And this work, I showed it at the Venice Biennale. So it looks like that. So these are life-size toy soldiers. And this work was also at the Venice Biennale. And at some point when I was in high school, I wanted to be a fashion designer. But that didn't happen. I ended up doing fine arts, which actually I'm not regretting. So this work talks about faith and fashion. My studio is in downtown Johannesburg, and there are a lot of churches around my studio. And what I've noticed with the churchgoers, well, they called Zionist churches. They call themselves Zionist churches. I realized that they actually regard themselves as soldiers of God, so they work for God. And I was very much interested in their uniform and or how they carry themselves. And then, yeah.
I want to also just bring in Yesomi and Kenneth a bit more. Kenneth, you mentioned how your collection, you're now buying video. I want to talk about what ignited that in the collection, in a sense of how it came around. Did you ever consider of ever going that way, or is it just the way people are now working that you knew you had to consider it? I mean, I know a lot of collectors in Africa who just wouldn't have the patience for video, because you have to sit there and watch something for 10, 20 minutes.
Right. I hardly have the patience for it myself, actually. But yeah. But I think that it's a kind of an organic process as a collector. For me, it's about storytelling, and I realized at a certain point, well, photography was a very accessible way for me to get into contemporary art. It was with no formal training, just reading about artists and having a passion around it, I started moving into acquiring work. And then, so photography became this kind of easy way in. But you realize after a while with painting, for instance, there's only one of its kind in the world, and it makes a certain specialness. And with video, it just became an extension of storytelling. It was, in my mind, really no different than photography, say, just the images are moving. And so in some ways, sometimes it can be a broader reading, or it can be a more, not necessarily grand, but a more kind of interesting way of telling a story. So for me, it's all one thing, even the design and it's just kind of ways of storytelling. So, and it also reflects the way we've moved in terms of media in our culture, so that you could say that video is very much the art of our time. So it would be really an absence in my collection to not reflect all those ideas and media.
And how are you living with it, in the sense that are you just displaying the video work in the Wedge collection, or are you living with it in your home? It's one of the most difficult mediums to live with.
It is. We live with it. It's usually not on all the time at home, but for instance, next month will be Art Toronto, which is like Expo Chicago, and I've agreed to have a group of people come in, the public, and we have 2 screens in the house, television screens, and I'll put videos on so people can absorb that. We live with the work very kind of casually around the house, but when it's lent to exhibitions, of course, it becomes something that's kind of integral to an exhibition. And we lend a lot of work with the Wedge collection. So
I mean, one of the key things about building a collection is also sourcing. I mean, generally people go to art fairs, but your collection is vast in terms of it's very global. I mean, in terms of sourcing work from Africa, how are you going about this? How are you finding things? I mean, one of the things I wanted to discuss was just how technology, in a way, is changing. You are collecting video, but the fact that you can see it on the, where are you going to find this?
Yeah, in the most unusual places, not the typical thing. The typical thing, I think, would be art fairs.
Yeah.
But I find moving away from the commercial fairs and going to the biennials has been particularly important for me.
Yeah,
So, but there's a whole new generation of African curators like Yesomi who are thinking about, thinking about African identity, to use a very general term, in very different and very innovative ways. So I think about someone like Elvira, Degani, who did this fantastic Yortaboy Gothenburg Biennial recently, and putting works, mixing up works from the continent in kind of maybe unexpected ways and unexpected kind of combinations. And I think that's where things are headed. When I go to these kind of events, sometimes I'm struck by an artwork that I would be kind of lost to me as a collector if I came to an art fair or somewhere where it's just a proliferation of stuff without the storytelling,
Yeah,
without the
exactly.
connections. So for instance, the Beneldi Herken video, which maybe we'll be able to check
Yeah.
at the end, it's a little 2-minute video. That was a kind of a miracle. That was visiting the off-site Angolan pavilion last year at Venice, getting obsessed with another emerging Angolan artist, Vidal, Francisco Vidal, and looking at his takes on Kanye West, and all this stuff, and loving that. And then my wife saying, you go around the corner and see this unbelievable, there's a little dark room which I never would have reached. And then, I see this video and it just took my breath away, the simplicity of it, but, the power of it. And sometimes, and then it was in my head. So then you follow up with the artist, and that's where you're going to send an email, and then you start having this dialogue back and forth, which ends up in a Skype chat, and send me some more examples of your work. And then for me, it's that kind of process. It's not I'm at an art fair, I like that, let me buy it. Like, it's a long courtship, and you get to know the artist. And
Which
goes like that.
also, in a way, informs your work, Yesomi, because you're in that term of, I don't know what it is now, maybe it's called the global collector. You're also telling a story with a collection, but you're telling it in a different way to the public in the museum space. How for you is that conveying the new story of what's going on the continent and the diaspora? Because you don't do African art in a sense. You are a curator in every sense in global, in terms of contemporary art. But how do you combine those stories?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to think too hard about how specifically I'm telling the story. All I know, it's kind of my story and my kind of particular take on things. I think in the museum, the Broad Art Museum, in fact, that was the perfect place to have a show on contemporary African art because Michigan State University has a very close connection to the continent. In fact, in the 1960s, they helped build the University of Nsukka in Nigeria, which is where Elana Sui went, and a lot of great Nigerian practitioners. So in terms of thinking about context and how a context might be ready to kind of tackle a relationship that has a sort of historical precedent, and I can come in and kind of add in the kind of contemporary contours of that. For me, I think that was very much the impetus behind doing the show. It was not only kind of my interest, it was something that I felt would be kind of strongly supported at the university with a lot of Africanists present and ready to engage in a conversation with these artists. I do think that, I remember reading a couple of years ago a piece that Okwi wrote maybe in the 2000s about the relationship of kind of representation of African artists within kind of how we understand the sort of global biennial space and the difference between representation in collections. And we're still very, very behind in terms of kind of a lot of these artists, whether the Francisco Vidals and all these artists who have kind of come into the international art scene through biennials and stuff, the forms of representation in the collections are still kind of very much kind of the traditional objects that we associate with kind of Africa, you know? So there's a huge gap between that sort of like traditional African art and the contemporary. And I think that's like a big challenge for contemporary African artists working now, because even though there's an impression that their work circulates kind of in these international spaces, how it kind of trickles down to collections, which are kind of what will stay the course in some ways, you know, in 20, 30 years' time, those are the things that will kind of represent a zeitgeist and kind of a moment. It becomes a challenge to think about how they can enter kind of collections. And this is why it's great to have some galleries in a kind of context like this who represent African artists and can think about placing them in collections internationally.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about Material Effects was that if you actually took the Africa part of the title out, you wouldn't have an idea that most of those artists were actually from Africa. It's not the content was just very, in a sense, generic in the way it was just bare. The color wasn't there in that obvious way, in a sense.
Yeah, I think it was a show of contemporary practitioners, and whether or not you want to kind of, it was important to kind of define a context because, of course, I was very specific in the context that I went to and also the kind of influence of that context on kind of defining the thematic of the show, but that wasn't kind of the be-all and end-all of the exhibition, you know, it was a starting point. And I think that increasingly people are making exhibitions like that.
respect that.
you know.
Well, that also leads into Mary's role, which is I always call the lone wolf. Whereas you're working on your own, but you also need to be. Kenneth was responding to you obviously as a collector, and then Yesomi's also responding to you as curating. I mean, when you're working, are you aware of these elements, or are you just on your own trajectory that you're trying to just come up with whatever you think you want to do, but are you thinking about their roles at all?
Well, what I've realized during my art practice is that the world has become small. There's a relationship between continents to continent. And when I'm in my studio, well, I don't actually think about the outside world. I think about how I relate to the outside world. And so I make work that represents me, I guess. Well, I know it sounds narcissistic, but I think a lot of artists are. So I think it's just, well, I don't think about what curators will say about the work. It just, for me, it's about the story, getting the story out there. And then, of course, there are curators who like my work, and there are curators that don't like my work. But of course, an artist's job is not to make work that is likable. It's just about, making work that is right.
Yeah, I mean, well, in a sense, in what you were doing, I mean, how, in a sense, did it evolve in the fact that you went from, when you were practicing, that you go from creating, creating Sophie, in a sense, from using what you do in terms of installation, photography, and performance. How do you craft those things together?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think with this idea started when I was in my undergrad varsity.
I'm sure they were telling you to paint or to stick to classic photography or something. This is also the thing about the new way of working in Africa, in a sense. Yeah.
Well, there were agendas. Obviously, they were pushing their own agendas. They wanted us to paint. I always regard myself as a painter, even though I haven't painted in 10 years. Well, the thing for me, it made sense to make this kind of work, and I looked at a few artists that were practicing at that time while I was conceptualizing around this body of work, and it made sense for me to make mannequins, and as a start, because I wanted to be a fashion designer, and I thought, well, it makes sense to make mannequins, in that I can dress up these life-size mannequins, and they look like me, so I'm making clones of me, and yeah.
And in a way, do you feel that that's how is that how what informs it first? In a sense, you're looking at, do you start with the idea or do you start with the material?
I start with the concept, with the idea, and then the idea will inform how the work should look like, and it will inform how whether it should be a sculpture or it should be a photograph, because I do photographic prints where I perform in front of a camera and with, of course, limited audience. Then from there, I'll have like 100 images, and then I have to choose one that will represent the whole performance.
And we're going to just finish up a little bit, but I just wanted to get a little bit from Kenneth and Yesomi in terms of how you feel, say, in the last, 10 years, a decade, and how, from when you were collecting, Kenneth, the collection, which point can you see how the collection just turned for you when you said, okay, this isn't going to be photography anymore, the Black identity is evolving, this is what's happening. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. There's a defining moment for me, because I'd been going to the Bamako Encounters Photography Festival probably 3 times over the years, maybe 4 times. And so in the mid-2000s, it was, strictly photography. I can remember going to a fair in 2007 when I think it was some video work that was introduced from Bushra Khalili. And it really got me. That was her Mapping Journeys work, which is shown subsequently in MoMA last year. And just, it was kind of like, there's other ways to tell stories. And then very quickly after that, it opened up for me. I mean, I hadn't really been considering installation and thinking about performance. And then like a kind of wave, it came forward very quickly. Suddenly, I was seeing shows at the Sea Museum in Harlem and shows in London, England, that were just kind of surprising me in their variety of media. A lot of performance. People were going back to something that I'd actually seen with artists like Fred Wilson and others in America that were sort of like, telling stories through, physicality. And it was just like a pretty amazing thing. It was almost like, it wasn't a fashion out of fashion thing. It was more like people forgot the power and the immediacy of sound and performance, those elements, and kind of bringing that back in, it always changes in significant ways. And so there's this next wave happening of, I think, a lot of contemporary African artists that are exploring the storytelling in a variety of media. And I think it will continue. I think this is just, the dam's broken open now. And it's, for me as a collector, certainly, I don't feel limited in any way to photography now. Now it's whatever helps kind of tell the story that I'm trying to put together with the collection.
Yeah, and for you, Yomisi, through curating, how do you feel that, in a sense, like Kenneth was saying, the doors have opened up? Are you looking, say, when you look at artists, are you thinking painting and sculpture, are you thinking performance and installation? I mean, have you seen a complete switch over? Or is it just more of a variety?
In terms of the types of things that artists are doing?
Yes.
I mean,
Or
I
what
think...
are you, and also, what are you responding to?
Okay. I think I have a very strong kind of post-colonial training, and that's my background. So I think I'm always responding to kind of the histories of the colonial as it relates to kind of the specific context that I come from and that I'm engaged in. So I'm kind of responding to works, to artists who are responding to that. But I think also as a curator, you have to be kind of on the pulse of other kind of developments and other, a wide variety of things, whether they're medium-specific conversations or whether it's more kind of conceptually driven or thematically driven. So I would say that I'm responding to kind of what I see out there as I kind of engage in the world. I think in terms of contemporary art from Africa, I think what's important to know is that the continent is alive and it is functioning within this sort of international context, but it's also functioning in a bunch of kind of micro contexts that I sometimes fall in and out of. And I think it's really important to understand that it's a very complex continent, of course. It's a kind of large geographical area with a lot of kind of cultural difference and histories. And so I think one thing to always be aware of is the kind of, not to reduce the production, production down in terms of how one might think of what's coming out of the continent to what we might see in these spaces, and to just be aware of kind of being able to kind of travel and being able to be kind of aware of different ways of working. So I think artists are continually doing that and responding to kind of the international and the kind of local context that they kind of engage with.
Okay, thank you all very much. Do we have time for some?
We have
Some
time for a
questions?
few questions. Yeah,
Yeah.
a few questions from the audience.
Hi, can you hear me? This was so informative. So I saw an image of, hold it like this? Okay. There was an image of Dawood Bays up there from Harlem, but nobody mentioned his name. So can I just give a plug, because he's having a show at Stephen Dater's, and he's such a phenomenal artist, and I love him.
Thanks, yeah. One of my first acquisitions, actually, Dawood Bey's The Boy in Harlem, and I'm looking forward to his opening tonight. It's going to be great. So had to do a shout out to the Chicagoans with that one. Yeah. I'm going to just, that actually leads me to something I think I should say that I didn't mention, that we're talking about the global market, contemporary African art. There's a proliferation of artists, African artists from the continent, living abroad. I think as a collector now, what I'd like to see are more black collectors, more black curators and storytellers, more black advisors and dealers, more black-owned galleries. Like, it's actually time to sort of, because it makes a difference. It makes a difference in terms of the legacy of the work, how it's shown. I think I'm very happy to see, Mary Sibande and her success, and that she's represented by Muna McKenna, Gallery Momo, a black-owned gallery from South Africa, who's also, got artists like Ayanna Jackson, who's in my collection, and others that, are being guided by a dealer who, has a deep cultural understanding of where they're at as artists. So I think I'd like to see more of that. I think it's important for me to mention that, because in my long 20-year journey here, it's the part that hasn't fallen into place yet. There needs to be more kind of black representation, not just the black artists.
And you mean, sorry. Just to make a distinction, you mean in the international spaces, of course.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, already happening, of course, in Nigeria and in Africa and the continent. Yeah.
So we have time for 2 more questions to you.
I have a question. Hi. Thank you, everyone, for the very informative talk. This question is for Ken. Ken, you mentioned that you started collecting once you were able to afford it, but I'm wondering, what was the turning point in your career as a collector when you realized this is serious stuff and I actually want to really pursue this and develop my collection?
That's a good question. What I should probably elaborate and say that anyone can collect at any level. I think what I guess I was referring to in saying when I could afford it was many of the artists I was looking at, as we all do, and seeing out there in the gallery system, it just was out of my reach. Later I realized that, and I still have this ethos, I've been able to grow a collection as a dentist, not some big captain of industry or someone with that kind of budget, because it's because I really do focus on emerging artists, and I think that's the way to go at every level. Even now, I'm looking at the fair today and seeing who's new. I mean, I can't afford a Kehinde Wiley painting, and I love his work, but it's just out of my range, so I don't even look at that now. As much as I love the work, I'm trying to acquire work that I can put in a collection that give it legacy, give it some gravitas around other works that it might speak to, and it has to be stuff that I can afford. So there is an economic kind of imperative. There's some, there are financial considerations that you have to have, but at every level, I think the only way to really grow something for most of us is to, get it when it's affordable. And then the way to do that in art is the emerging artists. And there's so much happening now. It's like you got this wonderful opportunity at Expo Chicago to just look and see and buy.
Hi. I just want to say hi. I am a dealer of color, 20 years, Karen Jenkins Johnson. Hi, Kenneth. You can please come by my booth. We have a full array of the Diaspora on view at 706. And I have been in business a long time, and the keepers of the gates have opened the gates, and the dam is open, and it's a wonderful opportunity to discuss personally about the artist and how it feels to be an artist a dealer of color representing these artists, and it's a wonderful opportunity. So please come and see me. I have a great stable.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you all for coming.